us for a couple minutes. All right, good afternoon. We're going to proceed with the hearing and with our next panel. We're delighted to have this panel with us, and we thank them for participating today. Our first witness we'll hear from is from the Alliance for Rail Competition, Mr. Michael W. Snowdich.
Snowdich? Thank you. Good afternoon. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before the board this morning. As you said, my name is Mike Snowdich. I'm the new executive director of the Alliance for Rail Competition, sometimes referred to as ARC. Though I'm new to this position, I'm very familiar with ICC and STB regulation. I, as manager of fossil fuel supply for PP&L for 17 years, I was intimately involved in rail coal rate litigation and for about 5 years I served on ARC's executive committee. ARC's membership includes many shippers of grain and agricultural commodities. Some of them are here today in their own right, and they gave testimony this morning. The board is hearing in detail about the various problems grain shippers face. I want to discuss three main areas. The board has fallen short of meeting the legitimate needs of grain shippers, which are captive. And I want to stress this word, captive. Put bluntly, the STB hasn't done anything to aid captive shippers, such as grain shippers, other than provide a forum for discussion of shippers' problems. The proof will be in the pudding if anything of substance comes out of these hearings to help the grain people. Let's first talk about rates. One of the duties Congress assigned to STB is to ensure that rail rates on captive traffic, again, I'm always stating this, stressing captive, which includes the captive grain traffic, are reasonable. One of the main areas of the board. Also, ARC recognizes that Congress also called on this agency to promote railroad financial health. That's what caused this whole thing back a long time ago, to get the railroads back on good financial footing. These goals always have to be somewhat in conflict. They're, one asking for more money, other person's asking for lower rates. The problem for grain shippers is that for 26 years, such conflicts have always been resolved in railroads' favor, other than the infamous McCarthy farms, which we discussed earlier today. Consider these points at what has occurred over the past years. The ICC started considering alternatives to SAC in 1986. No alternative was developed until 1996, after Congress mandated action. However, this is telling. No grain shipper used the three benchmark test the board announced in 1996. Finally, in 2006, the board proposed to abandon the three benchmark test in favor of a version of SAC that offers less hope than the three benchmark approach. In addition, as far as SAC is concerned, the segment cross-subsidy test recently decided to be used in SAC guarantees that grain shippers will have no chance of relief. It should come as no surprise that grain shippers regard the board as indifferent to railroad gouging on grain rates. The action of the ICC and the board make it hard to reach any other conclusions. Now, the railroads are certain to argue that they need high rates and they don't abuse their market dominance or monopoly status. In fact, the comments in the board's small rate case proceedings seem designed to make things even worse for non-coal shippers. Ultimately, the real test is whether any grain shipper has an effective recourse to STB rail rate regulation. For 26 years, as I said, the answer has been no. Let's talk about rail service. Being gouged is bad enough when rail service is good, but when service is bad, the system is broken. We heard a lot about testimony this morning about people not being able to depend on the railroad. It takes longer to move from an area in the United States than it is from an area in Canada. The common carrier obligation is mainly given lip service today. When there is no effective regulation of rail rates or charges, the railroads have a free hand to make good service either unavailable at any price or so costly that commodities such as grain and regions such as the upper Midwest, which people described in detail this morning, are stuck with second-class service. If shippers want more than a number of rail cars the railroads provide, the shippers are forced to acquire the cars for the railroads, as we discussed this morning. If the shippers want empty cars dropped off and loaded cars picked up when needed, they're forced to pay extra. And to top it off, if shippers complain to the STB, there's a possibility of railroad retaliation. ARC understands the board should not micromanage rail service. They shouldn't be in that business. As with rate issues, grain shippers are not calling for regulatory procedures under which shippers always get the relief they request. However, the board offers no effective recourse. As a result, grain shippers expect rail service to remain poor. The board needs to act as a fair umpire when rail service issues arise. Let's talk about what's happened with competition. ARC is not alone in believing that shippers with competitive alternatives are less likely to pay excessive rail rates and experience poor service. Talked about Economics 101, and the nation's experience with trucking deregulation support this view. However, the board in the past has sheltered railroads from competition in numerous ways, bottleneck, etc. Its rare attempts to encourage competition among railroads have been ineffective. The GAO, as discussed this morning, has suggested that the board investigates shipper captivity and railroad competition issues. The GAO also points to actions the board could take that would enhance competition among railroads, as he mentioned, terminal, trackage rights, and reciprocal switching. The board should also end paper barriers. In conclusion, the relationship between railroads and captive shippers has for far along been too one-sided, and the railroad's financial strength has improved. And believe it or not, this has not made the situation better, but has made it worse. The board must address this imbalance by learning more about grain shipper issues and by revising or abandoning policies adopted years ago that no longer make sense. Grain shippers need a chance to challenge high rail rates using a reasonable, understandable, not very costly approach. A chance to challenge poor rail service, and therefore a real chance to reduce railroads' monopoly power. Thank you, and I'll answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Snowdich. Now, next we'll hear from Mr. Terry J. Voss, representing Ag Processing, Inc. Mr. Voss, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Nottingham, Vice Chairman Mulvey, Commissioner Buttry. I appreciate the opportunity to appear here today before you on this very important issue. As you said, my name is Terry Voss. I'm Senior Vice President of Transportation for Ag Processing located in Omaha. We're a cooperative owned by 211 local grain elevators and cooperatives. We are also owned by 6 regional cooperatives. We have 14 processing facilities, about 40 grain elevators, and our membership has hundreds of grain elevators that they operate. We filed a written statement earlier in this proceeding, and I'm just going to highlight a few parts of that. I want to talk about the GAO study a bit if I could. If anything, the GAO statements about increases in the grain transportation costs I feel are understated. For example, GAO can only measure the rates that are really used by the shipper. Rates quoted from carriers that are too high that move any freight are not able to be used because they're not in the waybill study. They don't show any of the GAO data in the rate increase. The waybill samples alone only include the shipments that are moving, not those under the rate that has been issued. Has been increased to that level. They're excluded from that study. Rates are not the total cost of transportation. As we heard earlier today, there's infrastructure costs, which include track, high-speed loadout systems, scales, on-site grading capabilities, storage space, etc., to comply with all the railroad rules. It is not altogether clear, however, or if GAO includes a premium paid for freight equipment in the various car auction markets. GAO does not include the cost for the shipper furnishing private cars. We heard discussions about that. The railroads, however, do furnish all the cars for the shuttle trains, as far as I know. In the grain products area, shippers furnish 100% of the tank cars for ethanol and vegetable oil movements. A large percentage of the covered hopper cars used in the grain products industry are furnished by the shippers. 100% of the DDGs for distillers' dried grains are furnished by the shippers. The GAO does not take into account the reduction shippers have taken in the compensation level on the mileage allowance payments for furnishing the private cars. Yesterday in the National Grain Car Council meeting, we heard the leasing companies and car builders talk about rates exceeding $800 per car per month for new equipment. This is double what it was a few years ago, and the compensation level that the railroads pay the shippers has not increased at all, with the exception of one carrier. We have huge investments in rail cars, and again, these rates, the rates that we look at or talk about freight rates, do not include the total transportation costs. I read a portion of the AAR filing last night. It stated a USDA study showing that seed, fertilizer, farm machinery, labor, and fuel have increased from 36 to 153% over the 1995 to 2005 period. These inputs, as high as this percentage seems, is a small percentage when it comes to a per bushel basis on a price of corn. Anhydrous ammonia has gone from $600 last year down to $350 or $400 this year. That would equate probably on 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre to 4 cents, 3 cents a bushel. So, I mean, and that's the total cost. That's not the increase. So I think those numbers are a little highly inflated, or they're not maybe the reality that we'd like them to be. AAR states that their grain rates have only increased 12% on a mile ton basis. The freight charges as a percent of the bushel, however, are greater than transportation than in input costs. AAR also neglected to add in their statement that the fuel surcharge is 20%. That's added on top of the 12% increase. They neglected to add that into their statement. Farmer, producer, and the processor and the grain elevator have a substantial investment at risk. This risk should be rewarded by the marketplace. Instead, we see railroads telling us we cannot sell into certain markets. We must ship to carrier-selected markets, which can reduce the rewards that we would get from our own investment or risk. Carriers have stated that railroads have decreased rates in the early years after staggers. They should have. We sat here in this exact same hearing room during the merger studies, and carrier after carrier sat up here or came up here and said there are going to be efficiencies. We're going to have new efficiencies gained. We're going to have new markets that are going to be available. Rates will be reduced and service will improve. Rates did reduce for a while, and so did service. Rates are now vastly escalating, and service is not keeping pace with it. We have seen rates in the past couple of years increase from 2% to 300%. It is very difficult to sell a customer product for a forward period when we don't know what the freight rate is. These types of increases are having a huge impact on our export business off the Pacific Northwest for soybean meal. We can hedge our grain and grain products, ethanol, soybean oil, corn, beans, whatever it may be. We cannot hedge our grain transportation rates. We cannot help protect our owners or producers on their freight costs. I want to emphasize that our company supported every railroad merger that was here. We were not anti-merger. This company that I work for and the membership that owns us, we are not for regulation. We are for a deregulated rail industry. But we're in favor of a balance of equity and equality and a system that rewards those whose high rates are paying for the future infrastructure expansion. Commissioner Buttry asked us what recommendations we would like to see. Please give us an effective relief mechanism where when we feel the rate is too high, we can come to this board inexpensively or realistically priced and get a quick turnaround and a decision. Thank you, and I'll try to answer questions for you.
Thank you. Well, next we'll hear from Mr. Darrell R. Wallace of Bungie, North America. Mr. Wallace.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the board for holding this hearing and for allowing us the opportunity to participate. My name is Darrell Wallace, and I'm Vice President of Transportation for Bungie, North America. I've served in that position for the last 8 years. Prior to employment with Bungie, I've been employed by several other ag firms and have over 35 years of total transportation experience in dealing with railroads, including 4 years I spent as the lead transportation officer for a large Canadian grain cooperative. I am a member of the National Grain and Feeds Rail Shipper Rail Receiver Committee. I'm president of North America Freight Car Association, which represents the interests of car builders, car owners, car lessors, and car lessees of over 500,000 rail cars. I'm also currently serving as vice chairman of the STB's National Grain Car Council. Today I'm here representing Bungie, and all of my comments will be on behalf of Bungie and no other organization. Bungie North America is the operating arm of Bungie Limited. Bungie Limited is a global agribusiness company employing 22,000 people in over 32 countries. In North America, we operate 125 facilities, including dry corn mills, soybean and canola crushing facilities, edible oil refineries, and bulk grain handling facilities. In my position, I am responsible for all rail and truck transportation issues in North America. Today, this proceeding is not an inquiry into the pros and cons of rail regulation, but we feel it's important that we go on the record to say that Bungie is not a proponent of re-regulation. We believe the marketplace is better served when it's operated in a deregulated environment. And deregulation, we believe, has been mostly positive for railroads and shippers alike. We support a healthy and prosperous railroad industry. Healthy railroads are vital to the economy of the U.S., and ag shippers depend heavily on railroads to move their product. We do, however, feel that there is a great need to balance the goals of the railroad industry and the needs of shippers today for dependable transportation at reasonable rates. One of the reasons we want to participate in this hearing is because of our concerns that steep increases in rail rates to the ag sector will both weaken the U.S. farm economy and the ability of the U.S. to compete effectively as it should in world markets. We believe that continued increases of ag rates will result in a reduction of the U.S. farm sector's participation in those world markets. The board's notice asks several questions, and what we'll try to do this morning is attempt to address some of those questions. First of all, we agree with the GAO study that grain rates have risen sharply. And to prove that point, we did an analysis of some randomly selected origin-destination pairs. During the period from January 1, 2001 through September 30th, 2006, within the U.S., our rates on soybeans increased 27 to 120%. Soybean meal rates increased 16% to 46%. Vegetable oil rates increased 13% to 80%. Within Canada, our canola meal shipments increased 12 to 15%, and veg oil 4 to 16%. Now, what you need to understand about those increases, as large as they are, they do not include any fuel surcharges. So you need to tack on 3 to 20.4% additional increase for fuel. And the only reason that 3% is in there is because the carrier that has the 3% took a 16.4% increase in their base rate to compensate for fuel and then lowered their fuel surcharge. So we're talking rates that have increased very dramatically. What we'll try to do is give you the four reasons we feel that grain rates have risen so dramatically. The first one is railroad capacity constraints. The second is poor quality of service. The third, a phase out of rail contracts. And the fourth, private car usage. When speaking about railroad constraints, we all know we're operating in a market today that is overly constrained. There's no doubt that in tight capacity, the market allows for extraction of premiums, which is what is happening today. The same way that when there's an excess of capacity, rates will come down. Today, we've seen an environment, or we're in an environment that is unlike any we've ever known. The railroads have more business than they can handle, and they're taking advantage of that to increase their rates, as they should. They are using, though, their inability to raise rates to take or get rid of some business that they believe is unwanted on their lines, even if it's profitable. Poor quality of rail service is another issue. The capacity problems, we believe, are complicated by the poor and inconsistent service that a lot of grain shippers receive. While rates have increased sharply in the past few years, service has not increased and has in fact declined. And I'll give you a good example. Within the last month, we've had a 100-car unit train sit 18 days after it was loaded and released, waiting on power to move that train. Had that power been put on the train that had been moved, we would have a lot more cars to load. We would have been able to move a lot more product with fewer cars and hopefully unplug the system. Which brings me to the next point, which is the shipper's use of private cars. We use a lot of private cars in the grain industry. When we have less than stellar service from the railroads, we size our fleets because of that performance. That means that poor service means we size our fleets at a higher level. Those additional cars are a detriment to the system, and they place additional constraints on the carriers and add to the capacity problems. Consistent service will improve the velocity of equipment, and the long-term effect will be it alleviates some of the capacity issues we have today. Excuse me. The next issue is the phase out of contracts. We've seen a definite move from the carriers to move out of contracts and into public tariffs. We've lost over 75% of the contracts we had just a couple years ago. And the reason is very simple. When you have a contract, the rates are generally locked up for the term of the contract, and the carriers can't adjust those rates. When you move rates to a tariff, you can adjust rates on 20 days' notice. To give you an example of how this is happening, we had a carrier notify us the other day they were going to take a $200 increase on September 1. By September 10th, they notified us they were going to adjust the rates another $200 by October 1. So within a matter of 30 days, we took 2 major increases on one set of rates. The grain trade fixes their trades a lot of times a year in advance. When we have frequent increases like that, it adds a great deal of risk to the marketplace, and that's risk that the grain companies and the farmers have to absorb. Private car usage. Since the 1980s, the railroads have encouraged shippers to provide their own equipment. There's only 2 real major carriers that have been adding to their fleets, and they've spent millions of dollars adding to their fleets, and we commend them for that. Most of the ag railroads have not spent money on their fleets. Today, in the ag industry, shippers provide 100% of their tank cars and probably over 50% of the hoppers. Owning and leasing cars kind of locks you into railroad service. When you're running some fleets as large as what some of us run, you're going to take those rate increases no matter what, because you've got to utilize your asset. You can't park 9,000 cars. You've got to keep them moving. So you're somewhat locked into it regardless of the rate increases that come about. The other issues that Terry mentioned is that shippers are not being fully compensated for their cars. The law is very specific that shippers are supposed to be compensating for their use of private equipment. We've seen the spreads narrow. We've seen mileage go down. We've seen mileage go away. And we have carriers today that publish only a rate that applies in private cars. While the rates on private cars have doubled and tripled, we have not seen the same thing happen with the spread we're getting paid. So that's an additional cost that the GAO study did not take into consideration. When we look at the Canadian rates, even though I spent some time in Canada, I've been gone from there for about 9 years, so I don't really feel qualified to address the issue about the wheat rates. And I think the trade associations have already outlined the differences between U.S. and Canada. The only observation I guess we would make is that the rate cap on the outside seems to have had an effect of not allowing Canadian rates to increase at quite the same pace that the U.S. rates have increased. I do appreciate you for allowing us the time to participate today. We would encourage this board to help us find a balanced approach and help us balance the rail needs for infrastructure changes while providing shippers with a reliable and consistent service at reasonable rate levels. We would also ask this board to help make sure that if the ag sector is going to pay higher rates on its movements, that somehow we can make sure that that money is directed toward infrastructure changes that will be a benefit to the ag sector and ag shippers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. Next, we'll hear from Randall I. Linville, representing the Schooler Company. Mr. Linville, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will stick to my script that I submitted just briefly in the beginning and then just make some comments that highlight it in the interest of time and be happy to respond to questions. First of all, so that you know the context for my remarks, Schooler is and I'm representing the Schooler Company here. Schooler is a privately owned company that will celebrate its 115th anniversary next year. Historically, our company has engaged in rather traditional grain elevator business, storing grain in the heartland for redistribution by truck and rail throughout the year. In the last 20 years, however, we have transformed our business to become supply chain managers for a wide variety of agricultural products, including grain. In the last year alone, our freight bills paid to U.S. rail carriers totaled more than $200 million, and we marketed more than 700 million bushels of grain. There is no industry more central to Schooler's operation than bulk commodity transportation in USA. We use truck, barge, container, and vessel freight routinely, though rail is clearly the centerpiece of our transportation strategy. And although we are moving many different products, my comments today will focus on our core and largest business, which is grain marketing. I think if I have one message that I would like to leave the board with, it is all the things that we do today, I believe, should, and in the future, should encourage infrastructure investment. As I consider the highlights of my remarks and other filings that I read in preparation for my comments, I really want to kind of group them into two ways. Kind of as I look at the trailing indicators, you were given an enormous amount of data to look at. A lot of that was new and very interesting to me. And I'll just offer you my comments as a businessman. I'm not a transportation specialist, but I am a businessman that needs to use these tools. First off, the context for the comments are that I think we're experiencing broad growth in demand in transport across the economy. It's not unique to agriculture. And as was pointed out, we share the transport network with other parts of the economy. And we certainly in agriculture want to make sure that we get to use our portion of the infrastructure. In all the modes of transport that we deal in, it is absolutely a case that broad demand-led or broad increases in demand has led to increases in rates in all modes. Trucking sectors that we deal in, barge sectors that we deal in, certainly the rail sectors have been amplified in this meeting. And these will be maybe in no particular order. Another thing that, as I studied the rail rate data that you were given in terms of the trailing indicator, it seems like, from my perspective as a businessman, that kind of the elephant in the room that is not getting discussed is the density or the volume or the volatility of these different regions of the country that we're talking about. All of you know how big our country is, and the ag is largely the heartland, the Corn Belt, or a lot of these comments have been focused in the Great Plains. And I know as a company that operates businesses in all of those states that density of production, volatility of production, and business volume drives a lot of my decisions and my investment as a shipper and receiver of product. And I think the best way to maybe give you a parallel on that would be land prices are completely different in those regions of the country. Some as low as $1,000 an acre, some more than $4,000 an acre. And I would submit that density of production and volatility of production is a big driver of capital in the way that I look at business. Capital flows to this demand. In some of these regions that we're talking about, certainly we aren't shipping much wheat out of Texas. Wheat yields have not increased over time. We are shipping a lot of corn into Texas to meet dense demand in cattle feeding in West Texas. Industry has adapted to those needs and transport structures have evolved to those needs. Same thing has occurred in Idaho. We aren't shipping much wheat, or as was earlier noted, barley out of Idaho, but the dairy industry has moved to Idaho. Our firm just constructed a facility in the heart of Idaho to bring in distillers' grains in big trains. So the market is shifting and adapting, and participants, firms and railways both, are meeting the changing needs of the market. And lastly, I would say that it is apparent to me that infrastructure is absolutely at capacity. Seasonal periods, fall and winter, we go over capacity, and that creates all kinds of havoc across all modes. So again, I would encourage infrastructure, investment in infrastructure. In terms of leading indicators, most of the data I saw was pretty void of anything looking into the future that we can use as guidelines. And I would say that the trends that have gotten us here, the business growth in the economy, look like those are going to be continuing into the future. So I don't think the future will get easier. In fact, it may get more difficult. The ag market is expanding as we now have energy to serve in addition to feed, food, and fiber. Many opportunities for firms in the agriculture market. I see capital investment flowing to biotechnology for grains. I expect big benefits into the future in increased yields in corn and soybeans. That will largely go to Corn Belt producing areas. I think that will serve to even accentuate these differences in density into the future. It took us 40 years to double the yield of corn. We'll probably double it again with information I get from firms like Monsanto and DuPont in 20 to 25 years. That will double the density of production, volume of production out of the Corn Belt, make these disparities even greater. When I look at our operations, Corn Belt, Plains, what I'm looking for is business. And it's been raised at some of these Plains areas. It's competition, it's rates, it's access. To me, it's business. If we had more business there, I would invest in more assets to ship and receive grain into those operations. So if I would leave the board with a recommendation, what can we get to do more business in some of these plain states? And I would offer that some of the technology companies are investing in drought-resistant varieties of corn. And I know farmers farm the land. They don't farm to be barley or wheat growers. They can raise whatever is beneficial. Perhaps that is a win-win for people into the future. And again, I would close by saying I would recommend that we do anything that we can to encourage infrastructure investment. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panel. I'll start with a couple of questions if I could. Mr. Linville, let me start with you. Your business, I want to make sure I understand it. You don't actually have acreage under planning, and you're not out. Your business isn't producing crops, so to speak. You're more in the marketing.
Yeah, we're in the shipping, receiving. We buy, sell, import, export, merchandise. We have a North American network, 15 offices and 30-some facilities around North America. We have international reach, and at about 20% of our business is international.
How is your business impacted with the fluctuation of transportation costs in the grain industry, for example? Do you feel that at all, or is that strictly someone else's sort of more direct problem?
No, absolutely. It's obviously very dynamic, as you've heard from the different speakers today. But to me, the real essence is, as long as our firm is lined up to the ever-changing market, the shifts I alluded to, and where the dairy cow is going to be, where the flour mill is going to be, where's the international going to be. And as long as we're aligned with that, and then our business partners in the rail industry or the steamship industry are also after that same market, we make it through the evolutions, the dynamic phases with less friction than we might otherwise. When we get out of step with the market, it becomes more difficult. I've owned operations in markets that have been in decline, that had no future, no opportunity for growth business, and that's a difficult place to be.
I want to make sure I understood your statement earlier about business, and is your point that if the Great Plains states like the Dakotas, Montana, if they were just more productive in what they were producing, they would see more investment and they wouldn't have some of the problems we've heard about today? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I thought I heard you say.
Absolutely. Business volume attracts capital investment. It's more freight for any type of transport carrier, any mode of transportation. It's more for me to handle as a shipper or a receiver. And, to make these kind of capital investments, it requires business volume. And I think that the other thing I would add is the change is quite significant to me over time. Wheat and barley yields have stayed relatively flat for a couple of decades. In the same time, we're getting great increases in yields in these other crops, and that's influencing flows of capital from firms like mine and then my demand for transportation.
Okay. Mr. Voss and I think Mr. Wallace, both of you, I think I heard you reference that railroads occasionally, maybe more than occasionally, dissuade you from entering certain markets, if I heard correctly, or and actually turn away customers or stop serving customers. Could each of you expand on that?
Yeah, we've had instances where the prices that the railroad have given us to move freight has actually taken us out of markets that we've had, or they've restricted markets to keep us out. I shouldn't say to keep us out, but what they have done is kept us out of those markets. We've got one or two plants that we're probably going to close down because it's cost ineffective to ship product to those markets. We've had other instances where we've got facilities we can't buy beans by rail anymore because the railroad has decided that they don't want to haul the beans into the facility. And so they've priced those rates at such a level that there's no way we can afford to pay that.
And if I heard Mr. Voss correctly, we may not always be aware of those quoted prices because they don't actually make it into way bills.
That's correct. If you don't pay freight on them, then they wouldn't show up in the way bill study.
Hitchhiking over, Darrell said to your question, we've had it happen where we've for maybe 2 or 3 years enjoyed a market, hypothetically Texas cattle market, for example, and we ship into there out of certain origins, and the buyers start to rely on us and count on us for good quality corn. The following year, those freight rates may go up $200 or $300 per car, and we'll talk to the carrier about that, and they'll say, we want the corn out of this particular origin area this year to go west and not south, and we're going to take the south stuff out of a different area.
Vice Chairman Moley.
Mr. Snowdich, and I guess also Mr. Voss and Mr. Wallace, in response to your comment that grain shippers have no effective remedies either under the SAC or the simplified SAC, I'd just like to reassure you that the board members are aware of your concerns, and the three of us have been working on, and the board staff have been working on ways to improve our processes, and as I'm sure you've noticed, we've put out new rules or proposed new rules on these matters. I don't want to discuss them at this juncture, but these are aimed at making our processes less expensive and more expeditious and fair to all the parties involved. But I'm sure you all understand that part of the complexity of what we do and why it is so expensive is because we've been told by the courts that the SAC process is something that is accepted and that the courts have approved. To move away from that into one that is, which gives us more leeway, which is maybe less expensive, might be struck down by the courts as being arbitrary. Did anyone want to comment on that? You mentioned McCarthy Farms, for example, but that's where that comes from.
I understand, and we appreciate you trying to simplify the process, but I've been involved in SAC cases, and one of the problems with SAC cases as far as coal rates, and I've been involved in it, there were rules that were set up in the past, and when you do the SAC analysis and submit it, all of a sudden the rules that were used in the past were arbitrarily changed, like diversion of traffic. In the past, you weren't required, you were allowed to divert traffic to these higher density, to your hypothetical railroads. Now it is no longer allowed unless it is on that railroad presently. That is a serious departure from what it was in the past. But we put these SAC cases together, and for somebody such as a small grain shipper or something, it's not practical. We're talking, we used to spend $2 to $3 million at PP&L to file a rate case such as that. And that is not practical from the normal grain shipper to be able to do that. I recognize the courts may strike some of this down, but I think the STB has to take a look at what can be done. I mean, top of my head, I would think something, a revenue variable above a certain level, you automatically are able to file a case and you drop load. If it's not the 180, it's something else, but something much more simplified, not so complex and detailed. When you get into the SAC cases today, you fight on whether they're revenue adequate. Then you fight all those assumptions that go into that. Then you fight over the assumptions as far as revenue variable. Are they 180 or not? Then you fight on the assumptions that go into the SAC. And all this is costly, time-consuming, and it takes too much time and too much effort.
And that's one of the things we're trying to address with the simplified approaches in the SAC cases and the small rate case guidelines. I think it's an ongoing process. These were sets of the changes that we put out, but after we see how those work, we may find that we can do more. But it is going to take time. But I think we're all committed to try to make our processes more accessible to more shippers.
We appreciate it. It would save everybody a lot of time in addition to your staff in reviewing these rate cases.
Mr. Voss and Mr. Wallace, you mentioned that the railroads don't want to carry certain traffic that's profitable traffic, and that almost seems irrational. Is it because that even though it's profitable, the opportunity cost is too high for them, that they can take that equipment and use it elsewhere and make even more money, and that's why they're turning away traffic that ceteris paribus is still profitable?
A lot of it, I would say, is in our own equipment. It's not even the carrier equipment. But we're seeing instances where...
Or the capacity of the line, then, could be better used.
It could be the capacity of the line, because we're seeing instances where we want to load a train and the carrier says, don't load it because I'm not going to move it because you've already got too much traffic on the railroad now. So it's a limiting factor. It's preventing us from being able to produce as much as we want to produce or sell as much as we want to produce. But it would generally be more in our cars. In the east, we operate mostly with private cars compared with the west, where it's generally system cars.
But the railroad's rationale for that is they're just trying to ration the capacity that they have until they can expand that capacity, or the railroads are trying to constrain capacity so that they can get the rates as high as they can and maximize return on investment.
I'm not sure I can address that one very good, but I would say that whenever they try to ration the capacity for an individual shipper, The worry is that your competition is not getting that same rationing of capacity. And I think that's one of the greatest fears, that if they come to you and say, if, as an example, if you're running 10 trains and they say you can't run another train because you've got too much, we don't know that our competition is not running 20 trains. And if he's running 20 trains, then he's evidently got a competitive advantage over us. So again, it gets back to the level playing field.
What would the railroad's rationale be to give one ship a competitive advantage over another? Why they would, well, we're going to let ABC company run 20 trains, but we're going to restrict X, Y, and Z company to 10 trains. They would have a rationale for doing that, wouldn't they? It wouldn't just be arbitrary and capricious.
I'm not sure. I mean, I
think
think
it could be in a quarter they want to operate in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It could be in a quarter, like you said, a lane they want to operate in. It could be because the other company is much bigger and does much more business with them. It could be because it's moving to an area that they're trying to grow so that they can strengthen their position in that market. And it could be just because they don't want to haul that other shipper's traffic right then. Maybe that shipper took some freight away from them before, so they don't want to haul as much in the future.
Would that be a form of retaliation, say, for previous behavior, perhaps? Or could be?
It could be.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Butcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I sort of feel constrained here myself to correct the record a little bit here. There was a statement earlier about the fact that the railroads always win. And we don't have many grain rate cases to look at, but we have quite a few coal rate cases to look at. And since you're with PP&L, you know about coal rate cases. By my count, and I think I'm correct on this, the railroads have won either exactly half or almost half, maybe by missing it by one, of all of the coal rate cases that have been tried at the board. And as I recall, I think I'm correct in saying that that the court has upheld the board in every one of those cases. I don't think we've ever lost a coal rate case in court. So somebody can correct me on that if they have better memory or better records than I do. But I just want to correct the record on that. The other thing, comment I'd like to make, and I'd like to get the panel's response to this, is that I keep hearing that we have 507 railroads operating in the United States of America. We have about 500 short line railroads and 7 Class 1 railroads. I keep asking the question, how much unused capacity is there in the system when you take the short line railroads into account? And I can't get an answer from anybody. All of a sudden, the short line railroads are just dumbstruck when I ask that question. Nobody seems to know the answer to that. But I suspect, I just have this feeling that there's a huge amount of unused capacity out there in the system, in the short line system, that's not being utilized. I know Montana has some short line railroads, and they could probably use that capacity somewhere out there if the arrangements could be worked out. And it seems to me that it's in everybody's best interest, I mean everybody's best interest, to figure out a way to do that. And why it hasn't been done before now, I don't know. But if I was taking this much heat, I think I would try to figure it out. Anybody have any response to that observation? I'm just making an observation here. I'm not stating necessarily facts. I'm just making an observation.
Some of the unused capacity of the short lines have not been able to be used because of the paper barriers. They have agreements with the Class 1 railroads, and the Class 1 railroads do not allow them to interchange with the other Class 1 railroads. And basically, there's a paper barrier. There's not a physical barrier there. And I think opening up those paper barriers would do a lot to use additional capacity on the short lines.
I would offer that the excess capacity that's out there is in areas, in my viewpoint, that was built for markets of the past and not for markets of today or the future. For example, with growth in international coming in from Los Angeles to Chicago, big container movements, and then ag products to some degree going back, we need more capacity there. That's what the market is demanding. And there's no short line capacity that can fill that void. So it's got to be capacity for markets that are vital, growing, and markets of our future.
Comment I might make is that, many years in the past, the railroads were in a mode of kind of retreating. They were getting rid of branch lines, they were getting rid of tracks, they were getting rid of yard operations, getting rid of people, trying to cut back because they didn't have, they couldn't fill the capacity that they had. So they were getting rid of that capacity to become more profitable. When staggers came around, they started finding ways to be more profitable, operating more efficiently, trying to get some of those gains. And we're in a situation now where we've got, the situation is reversed, and we've got all this freight out there that's got to be moved. But the capacity's been taken away, and we've got to rebuild that infrastructure and rebuild that capacity. And there may be a lot of capacity on these short lines. I'm not that familiar with them. But on the main, the Class 1 carriers, there's probably some, capacity there, but it's minimal. And the only way our companies can grow is to increase the amount of business that we're doing with the railroads. So we want them to add capacity. We want them to be able to make money with their rates and add to that capacity, because if we can't grow our business, then we're all going to be in jeopardy.
I think it would be interesting to note or to learn how much capacity growth we would have if we got 2 or 3 more mile per hour on the trains. Mm-hmm. If you get a 10%, I think the railroads, according to AAR reports, are 21, 22, 23 mile an hour, somewhere in there, depending on commodity. If you could get a 10% increase in mile an hour, what would that do to capacity?
That's it.
If I could ask, there was some reference in some of the, at least one of the statements here about the concept of reciprocal switching or open access. Would any of the panelists like to speak to whether you believe that would result in more investment and attract more capital into rail transportation for both maintenance and improvements and possibly new entrants, or less, or not have any impact?
I think the perception is anytime you can build a facility that's served by more than one carrier, you'll have a warmer feeling that you might be a little more competitive. I said it's a perception. I'm not sure. I know that our company, the last 2 or 3 facilities we built have been built on where there's more than one carrier.
It's difficult to find places today where you can actually have access to more than one carrier. And when you do, you don't always have full agreement from the carriers to allow everybody to have access to those facilities. So I think Terry's right. It is desirable to have access to more than one carrier, but it's not always feasible.
Some of the shippers and folks we hear from who are concerned about railroad rates and services are pretty good, pretty successful at their lines of business, make good money, and more power to them. But I sometimes ask, why don't more people go into the railroad business? Why you guys, Bungie's pretty big. You guys work with some big firms out there. Not to pick on Bungie, but I mean, why don't more people pursue the business and go into it and create some more competition for us?
Let me respond for my former life as a utility executive. We actually looked into, building railroads and things like that. It's not your line of business. You have to take resources or energy from your core business and start to worry about the railroad business. And that takes considerable effort. So basically there's a high hurdle to get over before you decide to get in the railroad business. And it's even not practical for utilities. And we owned over 1,000 cars. But we didn't want to get into the building tracks or owning power and things like that.
I think if you look, a good example might be, if you look at the DM&E expansion into the Parte River Basin, and my numbers are going to be wrong, but they're adding, a couple hundred miles of track or 150 miles of track. They've been working on that process 5, 6, 7 years, and it's been blessed by the board here. But they're tied up. I think they've got 1 court case left yet. But the price of entry, if you have to wait 6, 7 years to get that in, the cost is probably doubled in that time frame. And I would hate to figure out or try to estimate what it would cost to build 10 or 15 or 20 miles of track even by the time you had to acquire the property and everything else.
I would add that I think the unifier that all of us have is we have to access capital from the global capital market. And, you know, railways, huge amount of investment. The profits that you get, do you have to reinvest those just to upkeep? What amount can you reinvest to add and still conform to the expectations of the global capital market? And you know, it's a tough business. I think that's why a lot of us haven't considered it.
I know a lot of people are crazy and get into the airline business. I'm not sure how people are so crazy to start building new railroads. But obviously acquiring a railroad, a shipper acquiring a railroad would be something that you thought might happen. For example, we had a case not so long ago where a very, very large company was considering bringing a rate case, a small rate case, and the company's revenues were 10 times greater than railroad industry's revenues, but I don't think even they considered buying the railroad to solve their problem. I had a question about, this is a very, very volatile industry, and Doug mentioned before about maybe we should have had this hearing a year ago or 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, things were much worse in terms of railroad performance and delays and all of that. And is it my understanding that today, though, even in grain movements, that things are pretty good, that rates are down, that a lot of cars are available right now, and the fact that you can get cars at below tariff right now because there's an excess supply of cars right now?
If you said rates are down, that's incorrect.
Right. Not rates are down, but the car you can get cars. You can get cars for October, November, December, et cetera.
I think the car supply has freed up. I think Burlington Northern Santa Fe said yesterday that for the first time in John Davis's history that he can remember in 30 years in the business, they've had surplus cars for October and November.
And when you have surplus cars, what happens to the rates?
I have seen no change. I've seen no decrease in them. Maybe I missed one. Okay. But I've seen no decrease in them.
But what I would offer is there is an active secondary market for freight. So when cars pile up, they trade at discounts. So I'll give you an example. A year ago, post-Katrina, to place a hopper car, the secondary market was paying thousands of dollars. Well, today you can buy cars in the secondary market for less than zero, a couple $100. Somebody would pay you to take them. So the secondary market does serve as a mechanism to price those supply-demand shifts.
Those cars pointing to the secondary market, you can get cars below tariff, well below tariff right now. Getting back to something that you said earlier, Terry, but you can't hedge transportation. But to some extent, you can hedge some transportation by buying in the secondary market, though.
Well, just because you buy it, if I want to buy a train from Randy for March, there's no freight rate guarantee with it. I get the guarantee I'm going to have the cars, but there's no guarantee of the freight rate. You know, my hedge, my hedge for the wheels are there by buying the train from Randy, or vice versa. But I have no idea what the freight rate will be for March. Okay. We know what we've got the corn or beans or soybean meal, or whatever product is hedged on the Board of Trade at, but we don't know what the freight rate's going to be.
Okay. And over time, the offerings vary. I mean, sometimes railways will offer, I can't remember the terminology, locked cots or something, which is rate fixed. Not all carriers offer those, but we've seen innovations like that.
But some do offer locked cots, right?
In some years, I don't know presently.
I don't think they're current.
Okay.
Yeah, I could be wrong. Carriers can answer that. I don't think there's anything I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Buttry? Well, thank you. We appreciate your time today, and we will now release this panel and move on to our next panel. Thank you. Which will be a one-person panel. If I can invite Mr. Gordon P. McDougall forward, representing the United Transportation Union General Committee of Adjustment. Welcome, Mr. McDougall. We're delighted you are here, and look forward to your testimony. Please proceed.
Thank you. I'm here representing John D. Fitzgerald, who represents you are in Great Falls, the UTU people employed at Great Falls. That's his General Committee of Adjustment. And we have a very limited statement here. It deals with the computation of the freight rate index. We've been waiting to present this for years. Various UTU people have. This is the first hearing where people have gone in to the freight rate index. And labor has not liked that index. They prefer the BLS index, the labor statistics, which is the index you use in figuring out the classification of railroads every year. But we have this ton mile, basically a ton mile index, which has been used by the ICC, the STB, and now the GAO. And the basis for the study is, they say, the rates of decline since staggers. Of course, they don't start from staggers, they start from 1985. They eliminate that first 5 years. And you can play with these figures in many ways. The actual fact is, and I think most American people will believe, freight rates have gone up in the last 30 years. The ICC said, no, it's declined 4 to 5% since 1980. And the GAO says, well, they declined 20%. Well, they haven't declined at all. They've gone up. They've gone up for grain, they've gone up for the general rate level. And there's not much more to add to it. We were not part of the GAO process. We were not invited to their meetings where they discussed with the railroads and with the shippers how to index these things. We were not invited to it. They know, GAO knows, that labor has not been happy with the old ton-mile index. They like the BLS. And the BLS is in favor in other parts of the economy, and they issue reports all the time. And that's what we have to say here. We're glad you invited us. I do want to commend you for having the distribution of the papers in advance of today's hearing. We used to always have that, but until about 4 or 5 years ago, the staff would not distribute the presentations prior to the hearing. So you would know what we were saying, but I wouldn't know what the next person to me was. And it's helpful. This time you've done that. You've made it open. That's very much a plus sign, and we thank you for that. Another thing I want to point out that Mr. Buttry will tell me something new. I'd like to say that the last time the ICC investigated the general grain rate structure, it's been printed. It's a 345 ICC. It was a 3,000-page volume 345. It's in 3 parts. And there's a big discussion on the grain rates. There's a whole section on grain rates, the whole U.S. grain rate structure. It was finally finalized in 1979. Of course, it's basically obsolete because the 4R Act has intervened, and so has the Staggers Act. But if you want to get the background to it, I commend you for that case. In fact, I noticed there's one person, one lawyer here, not me, but one lawyer in the audience, whose name is shown as participating in that case back in the mid-1970s. That's all I have to say. Oh, one last thing on the deflator thing raised by Member Mulvey. I think if you're going to have the deflator used, inflation adjustment, there's a big difference in the various agricultural commodities in their pricing. I would not use that average deflator like you do generally. I got to do it by the product. Because I remember when we did this, you two did this with the Chicago Board of Trade about 12 years ago. We found big differences in the price increases and decreases among commodities, particularly agricultural commodities. And I would commend you to look at that if you make any deflator adjustments. But anyway, we think you should use the BLS, Freight Price Index, as you do for other things in your agency. Use it also for your own rate adjustments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perdue. I have no questions for Mr. Perdue, but Commissioner Buttry, Vice Chairman Mulvey?
I just wanted to comment on pointing out that deregulation did begin in 1976 with the Quad R Act, and I think status is very, very important, but I think you're absolutely correct that deregulation really began with the Quad R Act rather than in 1980 with the Staggers Act, and that was interesting and a valid observation.
One comment on that. I think there's a lot of public relations for saying this is Staggers Act because Staggers was considered a labor-oriented congressman, and labor had not supported the deregulation of 1976 and so forth, not really supported it. The problem of the 4R Act was that the railroads were not coming in and using contract rates in 76. And there's a good reason, I suspect, was because there have been very serious antitrust problems in the shipping industry on it, and Commissioner Darius Daskins went out to Arizona and chided everybody, the practitioners, why aren't you using these contract rates? And the answer was, because we'll do it. The ICC will let you file these things. Railroads didn't do it until they got legislation. And the legislation came in 1980, and that was a major thing. Contract rates, I don't want to say that's not part of deregulation. It is.
It is. Yeah.
But basically, everything was in place in the 4R Act.
Well, it's an interesting point that staggers. The two big things out of staggers were contract rates and ease to get the ability to abandon unprofitable lines.
The abandonment standards were the same. In the 4R Act and the Staggers Act, the abandonment standards the same, public convenience and necessity. Procedurally, there were changes made in abandonments, and they had various things like that. The substantive standards of the abandonments did not change, and haven't changed today.
But interesting, the contract rates are something that today may be going away, but the railroads are still deregulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doodle. We'll now move to our final panel and invite the representatives of the 4 railroads who have asked to speak today to come forward. Give them a couple minutes to get settled. Welcome. We'll start with Mr. Kevin Kaufman, representing the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. And the floor is yours, Mr. Kaufman.
Thanks. We're loading up the presentation, so
Okay.
give me a minute. But thank you very much, Chairman Nottingham and Vice Chairman Mulvey and Commissioner Buttry. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Kevin Kaufman. I'm Group Vice President for Agricultural Products for the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad. And I'm trying to do more than one thing at once here, and if I get it right, my Judy. I've been a member of the railroad, or joined the railroad, about 2.5 years ago. I used to be a senior vice president for Louis Dreyfus Corporation, so for 25 years I was a shipper in a large multinational agribusiness corporation. I'm also formerly a charter member of the Rail Shipper Transportation Advisory Council, for which I sat on for 6 years, and that was a great experience. So I have more experience as a shipper than as a railroader. I want to start by saying that ag is an extremely important part of BNSF, and we've always been a railroad that is focused very much on agriculture. We have grown significantly in agriculture, and we will continue to grow significantly in agriculture. We would never consider demarketing it, and we expect agriculture to continue to grow, and we're going to be there. Unfortunately, we serve most of the western grain areas, and so it seems that sometimes no good deed goes unpunished, and we get accused of everything short of starting the Iraq War. But, of course, the truth is a little bit stranger than fiction, and we think we have a pretty good record, and we'd like to share that with you at this time. You know, the Staggers Act changed everything, and the railroads became more efficient, and suddenly they were able to follow market signals and appropriately size their capacity to the market. The fact is that, you know, Staggers is working, and the GAO has said so in their report. The most important thing that's happened is the railroads have regained their financial health, and they now have capital with which they can now invest. And, you know, as all of us know, capital is linked and correlated strongly to returns. And so it's no surprise that the railroad investment is closely tied to the returns it receives from its business. And so it's not a big surprise that last year we managed to get to a 10.1% return on investment, which for the railroad is fantastic. For the rest of the world in the equity business, it's not very great, but for us it was great, and so we see record investment last year of $2.6 billion.
So what's happened with that? Well, of course, you see the result that, we've invested in brand new grain-covered hopper cars. In fact, over 18,000 of them, and more particularly since the year 2002, we've invested in a tremendous amount of cars. In addition, we've invested in locomotives. While that's a total locomotive increase of fleet for the railroad, ag itself, the locomotive fleet in the last couple of years has increased over 30%. And so, again, if you look at what happens with a very key investment for ag, which is cars, it's directly correlated to the returns that we're getting. And so what happens? Well, in addition to making significant investments in cars and locomotives, the railroad has focused very hard on how do we become more efficient and more effective. And those are operational design changes in order to make the railroad more efficient. And so as Terry Voss talked about, you want to look at the impact of velocity in miles per day and the impact it has on what we can offer to our shippers. It looks like this. Back in 2000, we had a lot more rail cars than we have today. But today, with fewer railroad cars, we have a huge amount of additional capacity. And so the result of that capacity has been that we have been able to carry the additional growth in especially the corn and bean markets that we've seen in the last 3 years. And our growth reflects those increases in productivity on the farm. One of the ways we've done that is by introducing, and this has gone on for some years, but it's accelerated in the last 5, is a shuttle train. Now, why is a shuttle train such an important instrument? It's simply because it's a very effective way to move bulk products. Here we have an example of where a shuttle train, those cars will get almost 3 trips a month. It averages about 32 trips a year. So here we have cars that are turning 3 times faster than a non-shuttle car. What does that offer to the agricultural marketplace? An extraordinarily huge amount of additional capacity. And I would submit to this panel that if we had not done that, we would no way have been able to move the amount of agricultural products that the market has demanded. Now, many of them criticized us and said perhaps then that we're doing it at the expense of the non-shuttle shippers or the small shippers. The reality is, again, truth is better than fiction, because while approximately 30% or 12,000 of our cars are dedicated to the shuttle business, which is carrying 60% of our car loads. Fully 60% of our cars are only carrying 30% of our cars, or 18,000, and you can see that we've significantly grown our non-shuttle capacity as well. And in fact, what's more interesting today is the way we break out these 18,000 cars is we actually have guaranteed segments of those cars for certain small shippers. For instance, edible beans and peas and lentils. They have 3,000 cars a month set aside specifically for those kind of processing businesses. So how many of those cars have they been using? About 2,000 cars a month, and so we've been sitting with excess capacity. In addition, for small shippers who might not want to use our COT program or other programs, we set aside 2,000 cars of tariff orders a month. How many of those have been booked for the month of November? Almost 0. How many of those were booked for the month of October? About 100. So we're in a position today where, because of the velocity increases and because of the investments we've made, we actually today have more capacity for the non-shuttle shipper, okay, that for the non-shuttle shipper, because these numbers, when we talk about the numbers of break out these cars and the improvements in velocity and service, it's all about the non-shuttle shippers, because the shuttle shippers, those trains are turning. They're, by definition, they're never theoretically late. So what's happened since 2005? We've had a huge increase in the amount of capacity that we've been able to carry. Now, when you look at 100,000 cars, what that means is when we started out a few years ago, we were shipping about 900,000 units in our ag business. And so 100,000 cars is a huge increase in capacity for the agricultural shipper. Now, at the same time, and this is the rest of the story, which is about velocity as well, our service has improved dramatically. And what's remarkable is how little has been talked about this, is that if you ask our shippers this year whether there have been any service problems in macro, because there's always somebody that might be disappointed in a micro case, our service has increased dramatically. In fact, today, there are less than 1,000 orders that are late, and those orders that are late are less than 6 days late. So if anybody wants to order a car from us today, they'll get it immediately, and we'd be happy to invite them to do so. Now, when we look at costs, we like to look at the investment we made in rail cars, and we like to think about what the changes in those costs. Well, since 1980, those costs have increased 79%. You know, in nominal terms, our rates have increased 15%. Now, I know that, you know, we've taken issue when we compare this with other farm input costs, and I understand that transportation is a greater percentage of some of those other costs, but still it's illustrative that when you compare what transportation costs have done compared to other costs, it's still, we consider transportation to be a real bargain. Now, when you look at it in real terms, I'm sorry, but our rates are pretty much unchanged from the time of 1981 in real terms. And now, you know, we sometimes talk about RCAF. If you look at RCAF, the problem is it doesn't necessarily assume that any productivity gains will be shared. We, of course, would not be incented to invest if we didn't share in some of the productivity gains. So inflation has far exceeded what our rates have done. In fact, if you look at one particular market, which is wheat, rates have declined. And in fact, rates have declined across the board, whether they be shuttles, and shuttles are a function of productivities passing on, but also single car rates have changed too, as some market rates have been changed. You know, and further, when we look at how our rates compare to other places, if you look at like markets versus like markets, in other words, export markets to export markets, you'll see that the northern part of our country, despite the fact that it would be indicated that they're, you know, they're quote unquote single serve, that the rates are not significantly or materially different than any other part of the country. And so the problem is we spend a lot of time, excuse me, I want to back up, I'm not ready for that slide. We spend a lot of time, you know, talking about old news. And old news, there's been significant changes since 2004. Our service has improved significantly. Rates in the case of wheat have come down. And we would like to talk about the fact that our service this year has been excellent. And I think if you ask people to talk about it sincerely, they would have to say that the service has been excellent. And in fact, we have had members of these same groups who are actually interested in submitting testimony to you in written form to talk about the fact that they're actually quite satisfied with our service and not necessarily in agreement with some of the testimony that has been submitted. The other issue that Terry brought up, which I appreciate him doing so, is that we work very closely, and we want to thank Commissioner Buttry for this, because over a year ago he encouraged us to go out into the country and work with the producers. And in fact, in the state of Montana, it's another good news story. They're actually encouraging us to find ways to build additional shuttle facilities so that there can be an improved gathering network in the state of Montana. And we are doing that, and in fact, one facility will be announced within the next month, and we're working on 2 others. So we very much appreciate the ability to work with the state producer groups to work on these things. The other thing we wanted to mention in our testimony, and perhaps the Canadian railroads will talk about this a little bit more, is that, you know, the Canadian system and the U.S. system is totally different. And so when we cherry pick pieces of it, we really are not doing ourselves a very good favor of being thorough in our analysis. And so what we did was we commissioned a study in order to look at just the fact of which producers are better off in the U.S. or the Canadian producers. And it's very, very clear that in the last few years that the Canadian producers are far worse off and in fact are declining compared to their U.S. counterparts. There's no question that the Canadian rates are no longer cheaper than U.S. rates. In fact, at the 1,000-mile level, Canadian rates are the same as U.S. rates. This is old news. So if we kind of go forward, we think we've been extremely reasonable, proactive, and we've seen the results of what happens when we get reasonable returns. It motivates investment, that increases capacity, that increases service to our customers, and it certainly adds value to them. We think we've been reasonable and responsible, and we're excited about the future of agriculture because we think it's even going to be better. And so if we look, instead of looking to the past, we look to the future. We like to think that we know we're going to continue to invest in agriculture. We like agriculture. And we anticipate big growth in agriculture, whether it be ethanol or the other products, and we're prepared for that growth. And we, are committed for our service and capacity to further improve. But from the standpoint of these rate issues, as we testified in our filing on the small rate case, we are completely supportive in the STB's look to try and make their judicial review process more accessible for small shippers. We are frankly tired of the rate debate, because what it does is it takes away from our ability to work with our shippers to talk about how can we improve service, how can we benefit their business, how can we improve their businesses. The whole rate debate tends to take away the positive look-forward attitude that we would like to have in the future. So we applaud the board's efforts in these areas. We encourage you to continue to look at these things, and we'll be supportive of those actions. And we thank you very much for your attention and ability and allowing us to testify at this hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Next, we'll hear from Jean-Jacques Rouest and Wayne Adamanchuk from the Canadian National Railway Company. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, the board members. My name is Jean-Jacques Rouet. I'm the Senior Vice President of Marketing at CN, and I've been involved with the grain industry only since last May. With me today is Wayne Adamanchuk. Wayne is our Assistant Vice President of Bulk Marketing at CN, and Wayne's been involved in the bulk industry for quite a few years. I will not repeat what the board has already said, read in our written filing, but I would rather concentrate on some of the points that the board was especially interested, namely the interplay between the American and the Canadian wheat market, and how the regulatory system differs from both countries, since CN is in a rather unique position of doing business rather extensively in both countries. The Canadian grain market and the Canadian grain transportation market differs very significantly from the United States. First, the grain market and the land transportation supply chain market is dominated in Canada by the export grain. More than half the volume is export grain, and definitely a lot of the attention goes to the export market in terms of all the stakeholders. Number two, the Canadian Wheat Board, which is a single desk marketing monopoly that controls all wheat and barley export outside the country. They have the only export program. The Canadian Wheat Board is also including the nomination of land logistics transportation. Therefore, they're very involved in how the logistics transportation on land is done for the export market. Having said that, the federal government is currently reviewing whether or not what would be the role of the Canadian Wheat Board as a single desk mandate for export grain, and we'll see whether next year whether that changed or not, but that might be evolving. A third major difference is the federal and the provincial government have collectively invested and own 16,000 hopper cars for the grain export trade, and these hopper cars are older and smaller in general than the comparable hopper cars fleet in the United States. That is another major difference between the U.S. and the Canadian system when it comes to transportation of grain. Where in the U.S. you have a much younger fleet and bigger fleet, and it's all private. However, here again, as the fleet is getting older and the government is looking at reinvestment time, it's not obvious that neither of the provincial or federal government will invest in the fleet, and that model will probably change and evolve over time. Fourthly, both CN and CP, as both Canadian federally regulated railroad, are subject to a complex revenue system called the revenue rate cap. And the revenue cap only applies on export grain, which, as I said earlier, is a major part of the business on the grain side. Export grain moving to the Canadian port, whether Western Port or on the east toward Churchill and Thunder Bay. That is to say that the pricing that we can charge our customers is regulated to the extent that the overall revenue that you would collect over a crop year from August to August is capped by a formula of tonnage and mileage. So the more tonnage we move, the more mileage we move, eventually you generate your cap, and at the end of the year you file all your tonnage and mileage, and you file all your revenue, and eventually there's a cap system that puts a cap on how much you can collect from the marketplace. Finally, since CN U.S. grain business is mostly comprised of corn and soybean, and since the Canadian grain business that we move is mostly comprised of wheat and canola, there is minimum interplay, at least at the CN level, between the two countries as far as the wheat market goes. Because of the location of our U.S. rail line, which is mostly in the Midwest, and the natural divide of the crop being grown around our line, which is mostly corn, soybean, and very little wheat, the interplay, at least at the CN level, is quite limited. However, putting all this aside, the bottom line is CN is focused on efficiencies in both countries. And CN is focused on whether that's when you're working in a very regulated environment or a not so regulated environment. This crop season, we have moved about 20% more carloads of grain and grain product in the July to September period on our U.S. network. And we project a double-digit carload growth for the same period of October to December period, depending on the crop price for those money in the export market. At CN, we build a transportation model on the view that the overall supply chain is what matters the most. Therefore, what's happening and how we connect with the country elevator, with the rail land bridge ourselves, the export port elevator, not just the rail portion. And today we've had a lot of discussion about the rail portion, but the supply chain capacity and pricing is really a combination of all these elements, not just the rail. We need to be an efficient, seamless, interconnecting supply chain. To that view, regardless of the regulatory environment, we believe the maximum efficiency comes as a result of a balanced network, seamless interface with the port elevator, 7 days operation of the elevator in the country, 7 days operation of the railroad to the port, and 7 days operation at the port by the port terminal operator. Very high payload rail cars, high efficiency unit train or high efficiency merchandise train, which would have blocks of grains on them, like we do for half the business that we do on the grain side. And to the extent possible, to smooth out the seasonal peak of the crop. The crop grows once a year, but it's consumed over a period of time. And I think barley, earlier example was made earlier about deer. Those products obviously truly have limited seasonality compared to the effort to bring that product to market. That creates the best cost and price value proposition, looking at assetization, looking at the capacity in total for the whole network, including the non-rail part, and that creates also carrying capacity. You talked about innovation this morning, so I wanted to maybe just make one small point. The hearing today, we talked about the specialty crop market, which is typically it works in a smaller volume, so a carload type. And at CN, we're experimenting, promoting a specialty crop export by loading part of this tsunami of containers coming back at us from Asia and going back empty to Asia, and use some of that to move specialty crop. This month, we're opening a container plant facility loading in Edmonton, Alberta, which is in the middle of a nice growing area to move specialty crop back to Asia. And there is definitely one form of capacity which is really underutilized, is all these containers coming in, a lot of them going back empty and using capacity on the rail line and the corridor, and it surely is a way to move more of that, use more of that for products, including specialty products. On that note, if you have questions for CN, we'd be glad to answer those now or later.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rouet. Next, we will hear from Judy Harrow, representing the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm just going to get our slides.
Okay.
Chairman Nottingham, Vice Chairman Mulvey, Commissioner Butchery. My name is Judy Harrower, and I am Vice President of Marketing and Sales for Bulk at Canadian Pacific Railway Company. And thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to appear today in front of you. My written statement responds to the issues raised in the board's orders scheduled for this hearing. But during my testimony today, I will focus on 3 principal points. First, I will speak to GAO's conclusion that rail rates for grain are rising to a greater degree than rates for other commodities, and talk about how that is not consistent with our current market reality. Second, I will explain how CPR's rates for U.S. grain traffic are constrained by a variety of factors. We face direct rail competition with Burlington Northern through our U.S. grain service territory, and barge and truck competition to certain end markets. And we need to keep CPR-served producers competitive in national and grain world markets. Third, I will describe how CPR has responded to the changing needs of North Dakota grain shippers by investing heavily to develop improved rail services for shipments of grain from North Dakota to the Pacific Northwest. So first, the GAO report. And I know we've heard a lot about this morning, so I'll be brief. The GAO report found that rail rates for grain increased by 9% from 1985 to 2004, while rates for most other commodities were declining. The board, of course, has correctly observed that the increase suggested by GAO, and it was confirmed this morning, was a nominal increase that takes into account no inflation. I've shown the same slide that in fact was also shown this morning through the GAO presentation, which is a copy of Figure 4. It clearly shows that the grain rates, which are the blue rates, lagged inflation significantly, which is the dotted yellow line at the top. The second key point I'd like to make is that GAO's findings certainly do not reflect our current market conditions. As my written statement shows, most CPR rates for wheat have been declining and are lower today than they actually were in 2000. Our rates for eastbound corn and soybeans have actually remained relatively flat. And in fact, the only category of our U.S. grain business that has seen increases over the last few years is westbound corn and soybeans. As I will discuss a little bit later, these rate increases are a natural market-based phenomena to soaring demand for transportation of corn and soybeans to Pacific Northwest export terminals and at the substantial investments and capacity expansion projects that we've made in order to meet that demand. Overall, the revenue earned by Canadian Pacific Railway on all grain shipments in 2005, this is all grain shipments, is approximately 2.4 US cents per ton mile. So if you think about it, we move a ton of grain for the typical customer for about 2.5 cents a mile. By comparison, USDA has estimated that it costs a typical farmer in CPR service territory approximately 10 to 12 cents per ton mile to transport grain by truck from farm to local elevator, and about $4 per ton for elevation and handling at the local elevator. Our rates for line haul rate transportation, we think, compare favorably to these other logistics costs. Furthermore, even if the 9% increase in rail rates claimed by GAO were accurate, that increase, as we've seen earlier today a couple of times as well, would pale in comparison to the increases in other farm production inputs during the same period. This slide shows that according to the USDA between 1992 and 2005, the cost of seed increased by 68%, fertilizer by 62%, farm machinery costs by 71%. During the same period, farm wages increased by 65% and the cost of fuel increased by 124%. So as this slide shows, increases in other agricultural production costs, while they may not be of the same total cost, have far outstripped any claimed increase in the cost of moving rail transportation, which is depicted on the far right-hand side of the slide. Moving on to my second point, that CPR's U.S. grain rates are constrained by a variety of competitive factors. First and foremost, all grain shipments do begin in a truck. This slide depicts our grain gathering network, and as you can see, BNSF lines, which are in green, parallel almost all of our network. The testimony filed last week by a number of North Dakota grain interests in ex parte number 646 says that the typical truck movement from farm to elevator in North Dakota is approximately 10 to 20 miles. 2/3 of all of the U.S. grain elevators that we serve are located 20 miles or less from a BNSF-served elevator. So our rates are clearly influenced by the availability of competing rail service from BNSF-served elevators. As I discussed in my written statements, rates on grain shipments to the Gulf of Mexico are also influenced by the availability of barge transportation from the Twin Cities, and rail rates from eastern North Dakota and Minnesota to the Great Lakes terminals are constrained by truck competition as well. Lastly, grain originating on CPR's lines must compete in end markets with grain originating in other states, in Canada and abroad. We cannot price in a manner that would eliminate our grain shippers from those markets because we would lose the business. And as I will show you in a few moments, we've grown the business substantially, which is an incredibly important piece of the business for us. So product and geographic competition are very important factors in the real-world grain transportation marketplace. Moving on to the third point, our response to changes in North Dakota grain production and transportation demand. As my written testimony explains, grain production in the territory served by CPR has undergone significant changes. As this slide shows, since 1996, wheat and barley production in North Dakota have declined sharply. During the same period, corn plantings grew by 133% and soybean plantings by 347%. One of the key drivers in this shift has been growing demand for U.S. corn and soybeans in Asian end markets. This phenomena triggered a dramatic increase in demand for rail transportation of grain, especially corn and soybeans, from North Dakota origins to Pacific Northwest ports. CPR responded to that demand by developing an improved interline rail service to the Pacific Northwest in conjunction with Union Pacific. This interline route, which is depicted on this next slide, shows how export grain traffic moves from CPR elevators in the U.S. to the Canadian border point at Portal, North Dakota, then via our Canadian line to Kingsgate, BC, where we interchange it with the Union Pacific for delivery to Pacific Northwest grain terminals. To support this routing option, we made a number of substantial investments in infrastructure and equipment. We invested approximately $40 million in our line between Dunmore, Alberta, and Kingsgate. And you can see Dunmore on the line. It's tough to see, but it's under the middle yellow arrow, just above Coots. We also expanded our yard and track facilities at the Portal and Kingsgate border crossings to increase their daily capacity. We acquired a number of locomotives to support shuttle train services with dedicated power between North Dakota and the Pacific Northwest. And we have partnered with our short line connections, the Dakota, Missouri Valley and Western Railroad, and the Northern Plains Railroad to help them upgrade their grain gathering lines. And finally, we've assisted a number of the elevators we serve in increasing their capacity so that they can take advantage of the more efficient train load rates and services. The results of these initiatives have been impressive. The next slide depicts the growth in both the overall exports from North Dakota to the Pacific Northwest and the increase in the volume of North Dakota grain moved by CPR to the Pacific Northwest since 2002. The blue bars show that the overall movements from North Dakota to the Pacific Northwest increased from 75.5 million bushels to more than 122 million bushels over the past 4 years. As the red bars show, CPR's grain traffic from North Dakota origins to the Pacific Northwest have grown from 23.1 million bushels in 2002 to 51.6 million bushels in 2005. And indeed, as the narrow lines on the slide show, CPR's grain traffic to the Pacific Northwest has grown at twice the overall rate of growth in all shipments from North Dakota, indicating to us that shippers have responded very favorably to our improved and more efficient service offering. As I mentioned earlier, CPR's westbound rates for corn and soybeans have increased during this period. But those rate increases are an example of exactly how the market should work. An increase in demand for corn and soybeans created an opportunity for North Dakota farmers to participate in a growing export market. This in turn triggered an upsurge in demand for rail service from North Dakota to Pacific Northwest export terminals. We responded to that demand by developing improved interline service in conjunction with the Union Pacific and by investing in additional infrastructure and locomotives to serve this traffic. We adjusted our rates to justify those investments and to reflect the strength of demand for our rail services. As this slide shows, CPR's rates have not hampered North Dakota's participation in the growing export market. Rather, we believe it's been a win-win for all stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Harrow. Our final witness today will be Mr. Douglas Martin from the Union Pacific Railroad Company. Welcome, Mr. Martin.
Good afternoon. My name's Doug Martin. I'm Senior Business Director, Wheat and Flour for Union Pacific. I appreciate the opportunity to address you today concerning the issue of grain transportation and rates provided by Union Pacific to our grain customers. As a preface to my remarks, I'd like to emphasize that UP views agricultural products as an important part of our overall business mix as well. We take our responsibility as a part of the overall grain supply chain seriously, weighing the decisions that we make each day as to the impact they will have on our customers, our employees, and our shareholders. I filed an extensive statement discussing UP's grain business, and I'm not going to try and go over the whole statement here. I'll just focus on 2 points today: competition and pricing. Railroads in general, Union Pacific in particular, operate in a highly competitive marketplace for grain. One cannot look at competition simply by looking at rail options. As Judy mentioned, all grain transportation starts in a truck at the farm, and competition for it all starts there. In that truck, the grain can go from the farm to an elevator served by UP, or an elevator served by one of my rail competitors at a location nearby, or even fairly far away. It can also remain on the truck and go to a barge terminal, or even direct to a grain processor like a flour mill, ethanol plant, crushing plant, feedlot. UP competes against other railroads and other modes by inducing the farmer to deliver grain to an elevator we serve. We do this by offering rates to those elevators that enable the grain merchant there to offer as good or better price to the farmer than other competitive options. One of the mechanisms we utilize to do this is shuttle trains. Shuttles enable us to move more grain more efficiently at the lowest possible cost. If we fail to offer rates that are market competitive, the farm truck will simply pass by the elevators we serve and seek the best price in the market, less the cost of delivery. Just because a single rail carrier serves a particular elevator does not mean there is no competition for the grain. In fact, elevators served by just one railroad have always been common. Single carrier access is not the issue that some might have you believe. It is simply not possible for UP to systematically charge higher rates at locations where we are the only serving railroad. If we attempted this, grain from the farm, as previously stated, will flow past elevators we serve to an elevator served by a competing rail carrier, another transportation mode, or truck direct to an end user. Differentially higher rates for these shippers is a self-defeating strategy for us. Competition hasn't lessened, it's really stronger than ever. It certainly is more competitive today than the pre-Staggers era of rigid regulatory restrictions and collective rate making through railroad rate bureau cartels. Mergers have given grain processors, grain producers, and users more rail options, increasing access to more markets for grain producers and more production sources for end users. The GAO report indicates that rail prices for grain have increased by 9% in the period 1985 to 2004. First, this increase is actually a decrease in real dollars. As is mentioned before, GAO didn't take the increases in the general price index into account. Grain rates at the end of 2005 averaged 48% lower in real dollars than in 1981. At Union Pacific, we certainly haven't taken price increases, even recently, that get us back to 1981 levels in real dollars. Secondly, recent rail grain price increases do not imply a lessening of competition. In a competitive market, prices go up when demand increases relative to supply. This is true in grain markets as well as transportation markets. If ethanol-driven corn demand continues to increase and production fails to keep up for some reason with that demand, corn prices will rise. Our markets have to go up if we are to keep up with recent and future traffic growth. Gone are the days when we had ongoing excess capacity and it made sense to set relatively low rates to use as much of that capacity as we could. Today, traffic has to pay for the capacity it consumes, both new and existing traffic. The cost to add capacity in line, terminal, locomotive, equipment, and labor to handle increasing volumes when capacity is constrained is higher than was the cost of filling the unused capacity we used to have. Just to keep up, existing infrastructure must be replaced at today's prices. New capacity must be added to handle growth. However, no competent management is going to invest in any venture if the returns are available or below the cost of capital. The only way to attract investment necessary is for the returns to be there. If not, investment in the rail industry will inevitably decline, and as infrastructure wears out, service will decline and capacity will shrink. We've managed to maintain the capacity in our grain network over the past 20 years, but it is only in the last few years that we at UP have been investing in increasing that capacity. Based on the prospect of increased grain and grain products volume and rates that will provide an adequate return on our investment. Thanks for your attention, and I guess as the last speaker on the last panel of the day, I'll turn it back over to you guys for questions.
Thank you. Thanks to the whole panel. Boy, I'm sort of reminded of the great Dickens piece of work, A Tale of Two Cities. I mean, we've been here. We hear very two different depictions of what's going on out in the world between this panel and the other panels. It's interesting, but somewhat frustrating as well, because we're here to try to get to the bottom of what's happening. And Mr. Kaufman, if I could ask, I mean, how, in your opinion, you've worked sort of both sides of the street, so to speak, on this issue, for, as you said, and what would it take to bring kind of a little more peace and harmony out there in your customer base and your customers' customers? If you cut price rates in half, do you think that would necessitate, end the need for hearings such as this in the future, or just hypothetically? I mean, what can we do? What can be done?
I think there's no question there's been a lack of communication
in the past. I mean, we have not been very good at communicating down to, I think, in fact, Mr. Whiteside mentioned this. I mean, the people who pay our freight are the large elevators and the companies. And, you know, and historically, I don't think the railroads have engaged very well with producers who ultimately it is a pass-through and they end up paying for it. And so part of the thing, and I was a little bit sorry that we didn't hear a little bit more positive comments about the results of the reach out that we've made to our producer groups. But it's certainly communication. But the other thing is, a lot of the gas would be let out of the balloon if the producers really felt like they had access to a judicial review process that that worked. I mean, like I said at the end of my comments, I mean, I would be thrilled to not have to spend a lot of time arguing about whether our rates are too high or not, because it's an inherent conflict of interest. I mean, they would prefer our shippers would like rates to be, zero. We'd like them to be infinity. Well, so there's an inherent conflict of interest right there. And we would rather like to spend most of our time talking about how we can add value and service and that kind of thing. Now, there's no question there's a correlation between rates and investment, and so there has to be an investable level. Otherwise, the result would be if you don't have enough justification for more capital investment. And that's why I tried to show we've invested a lot of money in ag, and our services improved dramatically. We've added a lot of value. And
I'm very interested to hear of your support for simplifying and lowering barriers and making it easier to pursue claims for rate disputes. So that's something we're obviously very focused on here. I'd be curious, do your colleagues on the panel share that? I mean, should we be expecting lots of litigation from you guys when we announce whatever we announce, or are you here today to make some news and say, nope, never?
Never say never.
Never say never.
I think in the end, each issue needs to be resolved. Each issue, if it's festering for too long, it becomes bigger than what it is. So whatever those process or the process, there has to be a way to come to conclusion and then move on. And sometimes issues are, in the end, not that big, and they become big just to get festering for too long. And that's kind of the experience that we have, is being able to close issues and move on, then you can move a lot more brain that way.
Anyone else like to take a stab at that one?
I would agree that timeliness is key, in terms of diffusing issues that come about. In terms of how the whole process unfolds, I think it'll be interesting to see how that happens. But I think timeliness is going to be a key factor in terms of going forward on the specific approach you're trying to take, and as well as solution that comes about. It has to be a timely solution for the shippers and for the railways.
Okay. Vice Chairman Mulvey?
Well, as long as we're referencing 18th century authors, I'll quote Mark Twain with his lies, damn lies, and statistics. GAO obviously came up with observations using the same data, very different from yours. Obviously, you don't agree with GAO's conclusion that grain rates have gone up unfairly more than other commodities, etc. But could you reconcile what GAO did and with your own findings, and why or where do you think GAO went wrong in its findings?
I mean,
to the extent GAO is saying that grain rates have gone up disproportionately and unfairly.
I think, Vice Chairman, one of the problems with the study is it uses old data, and there's been a lot of changes since 2004. I mean, I think we submitted some corrections to the record on some of the issues. I mean, it's a big study, they're very smart people, but it's a very complicated industry, and so I don't think any of us expect them to perfectly understand the business, and especially it's not just about the railroad industry, it's about the peculiarities of the grain industry. I mean, we all know that the grain industry as a whole is a very complex and difficult business, and nobody, in my mind, has ever been able to write a tome of any kind that really adequately described the way the grain business works. And that's why it makes it particularly difficult for the railroads to engage on the grain side, because it is so dynamic and ever-changing, and it is so market volatile that it's a constantly changing picture. And it's just, I think it's a credit to our industry that we've been able to get it mostly pretty good. But at the same time, there's no question that there's haves and there's have-nots, and that's part of the market process, and also that's an issue of time.
To what extent, you mentioned about improvements in service, your service metrics that you pointed out too in your presentation, but the shippers charge that to some extent that's coming at the cost of changing who you're serving. In other words, you're getting better speeds by not serving the small single car shippers or not serving the smaller elevators. And if you're focusing just on the shuttle trains and the unit trains, it's easier to get better results. And overall, on average, they're better results. But you know, if you average 0 and infinity, it's still infinity.
You know, I really appreciate that question, because again, here we have, let's just say for illustrative purposes, we have 30,000 cars, and we have 12,000 in shuttle service and 18,000 in non-shuttle service. So it would be incredibly wrong or for us to sit there and say, well, we've got 18,000 cars and assets, we're just going to let them kind of float around and do a cruddy job of providing a return for the railroad. So the fact of the matter is we've actually significantly changed the way we handle that business. And for instance, I can give you the specific illustration is that it wasn't so long ago that we got less than 1 turn per month out of these cars. In fact, to be precise, 0.98 turns. Today, we're almost up to 1.2. Now, that doesn't sound like much on a decimal basis, but with 18,000 cars, it's a lot of additional capacity, and it's one of the reasons why there's excess capacity today. And so the railroad has actually changed the way we handle those cars. We've put them in merchandise network, actually in a similar way that the CN handles them, and we've gotten much bigger velocity than just setting agricultural cars aside, waiting to match them up to move them as a whole agricultural train. So the answer to your question is no, we are working even harder in improving the service on that, and we're real proud of that.
The shippers said before that they weren't, despite the fact that excess capacity is developing in the grain car market, grain fleet, they're not seeing reduced rates. Is that accurate, or?
Here's the deal, of course, is that in reality, when we spend a lot of money on cars and they sit around, our costs actually go up, right? Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So there's a tremendous burden for us to right-size the fleet every time. And the problem with the grain business, of course, is farmer wants to sell here. Oh, this year he's not going to sell here. He's going to sell there. And right-sizing is very difficult. So again, volatility demands, a different sort of compensation. And so the reality is actually our costs go up.
If I may echo that point, when you look at investing in the rail cars, you're looking at the rail cars usually snow over a trip or over a year. So you're looking at the contribution per car day on a movement. The faster the cycle, the less money you need to make in that movement. But if in between movement you got months of no movement, your costs go way up, because really you should not be short-sighted and think that when the car sits, it's free. Somebody's going to be paying for that investment, otherwise you won't invest again. So when you look at a business which is seasonal or too seasonal, you get the issue of who will take the risk of these idle days. And in the end, the user of those full days where the car moves will end up paying for the idle days as well. So a model whereby you invest in extra crews, extra locomotive, extra cars for peak is not really financially sustainable, because that peak is going to be very costly to either the investor who's making a mistake or the buyer who's paying dearly for this.
Right.
And our problem also is that the seasonality is not even predictable anymore. I mean, it used to be that there were typically car shortages around harvest periods, which logically occur about the same time every year. Anymore, there's enough vagaries in the marketplace based on export demand and a number of other factors that the timing of the peak demand periods is changed and changes from year to year.
So we want that business. The last car may not be possibly viable in any further condition. And just also, it's like when you look at an extra unit train that's offered to you this week, when you look at a shuttle service or something that looks like a shuttle service, you run your shuttle service as a conveyor belt. It's going to a port, and there's no point putting more cars in the country to go to that port if that port is not unloading when it passes. Mm-hmm. So you should run at least in our mindset, you run your conveyor belt based on the port unload, because the port is the bottleneck, could be the bottleneck. If the port is a little slow at unloading, then you don't want more trains to be given to you. If the port is unloading very fast, then you can speed up the conveyor. But as soon as the conveyor slows down, it's not so much that these extra train offered to you are not profitable. It's just there's no point putting in the conveyor because the stuff is not moving well at the conveyor at the port.
Commissioner Buttrey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kaufman, you mentioned about the fact that, I know you may not be able to talk about this in public because maybe some of this is still being negotiated, and I wouldn't want to ask about that, but you mentioned two other, I think you said shuttle loading facilities in Montana. Is that in addition to Fort Benton, or is that including Fort Benton?
It's including Fort Benton.
Including Fort Benton, so
Right.
it's Fort Benton and one other one.
Right. It's actually not in Fort Benton, but it's on that line.
Right. I forget the name of the town where it actually is, but I call it Fort Benton because it's easy for me to remember. Will this addition of rail service, I know Fort Benton is not, but will this addition of another shuttle facility be on a rail line that's already active rail line, or will it require you to reactivate some land that hasn't been used in recent history?
Actually, it will be on a short line.
It'll be on a short line.
It'll be on a short line.
Okay. What percentage of the car loadings that you have do you think is touched by a short line railroad?
I don't have that statistic, but it's interesting though that our largest shuttle loader is on a short line. I mean, so I can't tell you precisely how many cars.
You mean the largest in terms of loading facilities or track, or you
total
mean
cars,
the one that
total
produces
cars
the
loaded.
most volume?
Exactly.
The one that produces the most volumes on the short line.
Right.
Okay. And how many different short lines do you interchange with?
Of course, I'm gonna miss some, and so somebody's going to be offended. But I mean, for instance, DM&E is one of the railroads that actually has the largest shuttle loader on it. RVW. There's the Yellowstone and Western Railroad in Montana. I mean, we have a number of short line partners, and we work with them because they have customers on there, and if they have the density of grain produced in that area, then we work with them. We actually drive the shuttle on their line with our locomotives right to the origin. It gets loaded, and it just pulls out.
And you're moving, I presume you're moving some coal on those lines as well, or is it just almost exclusively grain?
In this particular case, in the grain business, in our grain areas, it's most of these short lines I'm talking about are moving grain.
Okay. The Canadian Grain Board is like a nonprofit corporation, quasi-government corporation. Is that basically a good description of it, or do you have a better one?
Not to what I understand of the board is really it's run for the farmers, and all the money, one way or another, after all the costs and deductions going back to the farmers in the price that they get for their product at the port.
So if they miss it in terms of the margin on what they're paying and what they're actually collecting when they sell the grain, and they're selling it on the global marketplace, so there's probably room there for some fairly large fluctuations between what they paid for the grain up front and what they sell it for. They're not, since they're not allowed to make a profit, in quotes, that money goes back to the producers using some formula or something, or
It goes back into a fund.
What they will typically do, because of the vagaries of the market, and it's tough to peg the price for the entire crop year, is at the beginning of each crop year they will establish an initial price. So for any farmer who's delivering wheat or barley to the wheat board, and the price will vary by pools. Barley is different than wheat. And then they sell through the year. And if they're selling for more than that or less than that, and if they're paying additional costs for handling or that, they pool all those costs, and at the end of the year they'll make a final payment to the producer on the basis of their deliveries in the simplest fashion that I can explain.
The final payment is how the account gets closed.
I'm sorry, what was that?
The final payment is how this whole thing
Gets resolved.
goes back to the
Like a clearinghouse,
Yeah,
sort of
that's
a
right.
clearinghouse.
Yeah.
Okay. And they do that on an annual basis. So the whole system starts over again August of the next year.
Yes.
Okay. Some people make a lot of this baseball arbitration issue. It's been mentioned a couple, 3 times today. And anytime you discuss this issue, the baseball arbitration issue comes up. Am I correct in saying that the raw number of baseball arbitrations that are filed, if you will, requests for arbitration are filed, is a public information kind of thing, or is that publicly known, or is that a secret between the railroad being filed against and the person filing the claim? Now, my understanding is that, to my surprise, actually, there are very few of these.
That's
I
correct.
think the number may be public, but each decision is confidential.
Correct.
But the number of FOA is, I would think, is probably in the public domain, but the conclusion of each FOA, the outcome is confidential.
It's confidential.
That's correct.
Is the number that had been filed with any particular railroad confidential?
No.
That's public. Am I correct in assuming, in my assumption or my understanding, not assumption, understanding that there are very few of these, and I'm talking about less than 2 dozen a year or less than a dozen a year or something like that, or is that out of the ballpark?
Basis, there's very few.
Is that in the ballpark?
Yeah, even less. On a relative basis, it's very few.
I'm sorry?
It's very few. You know,
Very
relative
few.
to the whole size of the marketplace, that's the number of all contract negotiated all the time. It's used fairly, on a pretty limited basis.
Okay. On the CP, do you have any idea how many of the cars, total car loadings you have, what percentage would be handled by in first instance by a shoreline railroad?
I was trying to
You
figure
can
out as
answer
you were
several
asking me.
shoreline railroads.
Yeah, well, no, on the, in the U.S. portion, the U.S. part of our business, we have two
I'm
shoreline.
talking about just U.S.
Yeah, just U.S. We work with the Dakota, Missouri Valley Railway and the Northern Plains Railway. Those are the two major short lines that we work with. And, you know, if you look at the map, their total mileage as compared to our mileage is almost equal. They have a lot of grain originations, very similar to what Kevin was talking to on the Burlington Northern. They have a lot of large grain originations for us in the U.S. network as well. If you look at our main line that runs, you know, up from Chicago up through Portal, I mean, that is our main line, and we don't have a lot of, we do have some large shuttle loaders on that line, but there are also shuttle loaders on the short lines, probably to an equal degree. I couldn't give you the breakdown of cars, though, I'm sorry, in terms of how many originate on the short lines versus ours.
Is Bisbee and Bernard the only two places where you have co-located shuttle facilities? Looks like on the map those are the only two. Is that right? Or is it Oaks?
Well, Oaks, what you see there is that, in fact, Burlington Northern and ourselves both, you know, service Oaks.
Serve the same facility, not two different facilities.
I don't believe we serve the same facility. I believe we have separate
It's two
facilities
different
there.
it's two different shuttle locations.
Yes.
Okay. Virtually co-located. Okay. Same for Bisbee.
That's correct. Bisbee, of course, is on our short line. The dotted line that you see across the top, that's the Northern Plains Railroad. If you look at the red dotted line that goes across, that is the Northern Plains Railroad.
Thank you.
We had some testimony earlier today. You, I'm sure, heard those of you who were here, I think most of you were, about basically stating that we would have more witnesses today, perhaps better information, more information, but for concerns amongst farmers and or shippers about some type of retaliation, some type of negative action that would take place emanating from railroads towards farmers and shippers. Can I get any assurances today that this does not happen? I've not seen any evidence, but what you would do in that case, or I can't tell you how serious we would take that. I think I can fairly speak for my colleagues if we thought that it was actually a fact that we were not getting needed information because of such a situation. But I think since the issue was raised in the spirit of fairness, I ought to give you a chance to at least speak to it.
I mean, frankly, I'm offended. I mean, we would be disciplined. I'd lose my job. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, that's just not the way we do business. I mean, look, we have disagreements with our customers, you know, because either we may have two different interests in a particular case, but we would never, ever retaliate against anybody for coming before the board. We're happy for people to come before the board. I don't know what else to say.
But if I can interrupt for 1 second, what we often hear is it's not management policy, and it's not senior management policy. But what happens sometimes is somebody a complaint comes in, and they get angry at the person out in the field, and then that person out in the field retaliates. He says, well, I'll get even, and that sort of thing happens. And as you say, they might lose their job, but apparently that's where the fear emanates from, not that it is a company policy.
Not only, I mean, you know, we take very seriously the interaction that we have with any customers, as I'm sure all the railroads here do. And, you know, it's perfectly possible that somebody a local operations person might deal offensively with a customer. If that happens, though, and I find out about it or we find out about it, we basically coach that individual about the proper way to treat a customer. So, I mean, this is just something we don't tolerate.
I could assure you on behalf of CN that, no, we do not promote or engage into any retaliation. I mean, we're on the service industry. It starts with the customer. The transportation market right now is pretty good. It will not always be good. We're also in a cyclical industry, and we need our customers to grow, to pay for the investment that we're investing right now at a record level. And no industry can afford to turn off customer for the long run. But from time to time, you do have disagreement, and from time to time, these disagreements are difficult to reconcile, and people maybe have some sour feeling, but retaliation, no. I mean, disagreement from time to time. But again, we're business, private business. We both need to find a way to generate not a high profit, but a sustainable profit. And sometimes it's difficult to find a solution that generate that. But no, retaliation. I would hope that customers would feel more, those who would feel that way would want to come forward more specifically, either the confidential process that you offer, or in a case like the CN, we create a service group for them to be able to bypass all these different steps and go directly to the service groups, like a service dealer when you buy a car. You go to somebody who will just do that and use different avenues to get their voice heard and their issues resolved.
Yeah, from our perspective, we would be extremely disappointed if we thought that any of our customers were afraid to come forward and testify or speak in any way, quite frankly, in front of this type of a hearing. We actively solicit feedback from our customers, from our president and CEO, all the way, quite frankly, down to customer service reps that are literally on the phone with customers every day. So we would be very disappointed if we heard that customers were, that our customers were afraid of any type of retaliation. Just very surprised, actually.
And they could use the board's offer of this morning to use your service if you to be the go-between if you wish to resolve, bring these issues to it. Go ahead.
Our policy at UP is really no different than any of my other counterparts. We take something, an occurrence like that, very seriously. It's not in our long-term best interest to prevent any of our customers from dealing with you on any matters that they feel that they would need to. Very simple.
Okay. We've heard lots today, and I hear lots in my travels and visits with farmers and shippers about the whole variety that they describe of transportation-related costs that they feel have been shifted from the railroad onto their shoulders, whether it be car ownership, the requirement or the need they feel to drive longer distances and wait sometimes in long lines for the large shuttle facilities. Help me understand, what's going on out there, and is this a situation of farmers and shippers somehow not knowing how to manage their risks and their exposure, or is this some example of the railroads unfairly exercising market power? Help me understand what's going on and why we should be comfortable with it.
I mean, some of it's historical. I mean, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, I've worked for Union Pacific or a predecessor company for over 30 years, and I don't remember when we've ever owned tank cars, as an example. It's a specialty piece of equipment. There are contamination issues and things that we're frankly just not very well able to deal with. Some of the other specialty type hopper cars are similar in vein that it just doesn't make sense for us to invest in them. We couldn't get the kind of productivity in all likelihood that the customer direct could himself.
I mean, you think about it. I mean, part of it is trying to align economic interests. I mean, if somebody is able to store their product on our tracks, there's certain consequences and there's certain benefits that accrue to somebody that gets free storage on the tracks. When you do that, that basically encourages one set of economic behavior at the consequence of somebody else. And historically, some of those things were allowed to happen. I mean, I think the railroads, in reacting to the capacity changes that have occurred, have basically gone through their decks of businesses trying to figure out how to extract more capacity from the existing plant. So that may mean that whereas before they had excess tracks and you could go ahead and store your product on the railroad, that's no longer works anymore because we can't then move the overall volume of the railroad that the railroad needs. And so we will go back and say, we're not going to lease those tracks to you. or we're going to raise the price of leasing the tracks because we can no longer afford it, and in fact, we're subsidizing your business. It's all about costs. I mean, if we owned a tank car, we would have to build the infrastructure to be able to clean the tank cars. I mean, there's a lot to tank cars, and we would have to pass those costs on. So it's you know, when we talk about those things, it's just, where do you want the cost to reside? In the rate? I mean, it's just part of the cost of overall transportation. And in the case of DDGs, for example, that's a perfect example. Why don't we want DDGs to go into our rail car? Well, I can show you a picture of a rail car with a 1 foot by 1 foot torched cut out of it because he couldn't unload the car because the stuff's stuck on the inside of the car. Well, that's not really a really good utilization of our cars to cut holes in them. And so we say, you want to ship DDGs? You go ahead and use your own cars, because then the incentive will be make a product that will flow through the cars instead of giving us the product in the car and forcing us to figure out how to unload it. So it's this kind of economic incentive in the, you know, exchange of costs.
These are different products. In one case, maybe the historical product was, here's the price for moving the product from A to B in a railroad car. So transportation, including the car itself. More and more today, we'll do the transportation, but you provide the car, and we'll have a lower rate. And then the debate is about whether the rate is acceptable between the fact that we now no longer provide the car and we used to provide the car. Another service is you load the car, but you actually park the car for 3 days. You don't want to ship it right away. That's called storage. Now, storage on wheel, that's a service in itself. It's not a dumping of accessorial charge. It's a service in itself. You're not buying warehouse on wheel. Or if you buy the warehouse on wheel inside your plant on my track, now you're also using my track. So you go from historically selling transportation, including the railroad car, now selling transportation using somebody else's car, selling not transportation at all, but just storage, temporary storage for 3 days in my car and my track, or just for 2 or 3 days in my car in your track. So these are different products that you sell, and they come at different price. And you know, as Kevin said, in some cases, if the product is not generic, or if it's a tank car, then we can't easily move from one commodity to another or customer to another. It becomes too specialized, and we can't really invest in that because we're not in the business of DDG or ethanol, and so we don't have. We would just do hook and haul.
I mean, our experience at this point on the U.S. side, we haven't felt quite the same impacts of ethanol and DDG yet. We will. So at this point, the majority of the hopper cars that we use in our grain business are still owned by the railway. We have not seen the impact of private cars from a hopper car perspective into our fleets. Tank cars, as you've heard from everybody, that's always been the case. Tank cars have been owned by the private industry, and they continue to be, so that's no change.
The private car model in many cases work well. You look in the plastic industry where they use the private car for 2 reasons: to move the product, and the product is very specialized, but also they want the car to, they want to do some amount of storage on wheel. Yeah. And in some industries, you know, plastic is not the only industry, has this need sometimes to store product on wheel, and that's where the private car model maybe works better than the railroad model.
Okay. Vice Chairman Mulvey.
One last question. On this final off arbitration, in my conversations with people up in Canada as well as down here, I know that it's not the most popular procedure with the Canadian railroads, but the criticisms I hear are two: that one, the people who do the arbitration are often unaware of the economics of the railroad industry, and then two, there's no precedential value, so every arbitration is something of a crapshoot. But if you could design a final off arbitration that addressed both of those issues, that the arbitrators were people with some expertise, and you could develop some procedure or some precedential value to the findings, so that there was consistency. Do you think final off arbitration would be an acceptable way of resolving some of these issues, or do you think there's still problems beyond those two complaints?
Well, I will make my comments strictly to what it relates to the Canadian environment, which you have to take it as a whole, not just the FOA process. If you just take the FOA process in isolation, I think you need to put out the whole system, including the other element of how the Canadian regulation applies to transportation. But arbitration, the CN position on the FOA, at least as it applies in Canada, is nothing wrong with arbitration. Nothing wrong with baseball arbitration. We find first of all, it leaves too much scar to go through this process, and we find from a commercial basis, it makes things difficult. Number two, there's really no rule assigned to the arbitrator as to what he will guide his decision. And also, some of the arbitrator may not have much skill in the transportation market from the pool, so you get into a whole education process through the arbitration process itself. And in the end, you cannot get a written decision whether you won or you lost. You're not too sure why you won or you lost because you're not getting a written decision. So we think there's a couple of maybe major flaws that could be looked at and fixed to make the process more positive and maybe more business-like.
Okay.
I really don't have anything to add to that. I think it's a good answer, JJ. Yeah.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Commissioner Buttry? I just had a couple more questions. Thanks for your patience. It's often, as I sit here and as we work here at the board, it's often hard for us to discern when we hear about service problems or delays, things such as farmers having to wait 5 and 6 hours at a terminal for a shuttle train to be loaded, and the attendant costs of that, especially when it's during harvest season. Are instances like that, in your experience, more often the cause of the railroad, or more often the cause of someone else? Obviously, we can't hold you accountable for problems that you don't cause, but it's not always easy for us as we sit here to know what's going on out there.
The ag logistics supply chain is very complicated. And, during gut slot harvest, you're going to always have truck lines and an elevator. I mean, because nobody's going to make the investment in an infrastructure so big just to meet the needs for a week period. The other thing, for instance, if you take, for example, the market with Iraq, they announced 400,000 tons of business sold to Iraq last week. That's great news. The problem is Iraq buys FOB. Now, what that means is that they control the ocean-going vessels. And so while they will buy in their commitment December, January, February, what happened last year is they bought the same thing and they delivered the vessels in April. So was there a truck line in January? Yeah, there was. Was it because there was no railroad service? No, it was because the elevator was filled up. There was no place for the rail cars to go because there was no business, there was no elevation capacity at P&W. So it's a very complicated thing. Now, I get the fact that the farmer is frustrated when he's sitting in his truck and he wants to shake his fist at somebody because he wants to turn around and get back to his harvester as quickly as possible. Today, a harvesting machine basically harvests about 600 bushels every 15 minutes. One of the reasons why these whole shuttle facilities, the network has changed so much, is to be able to receive that volume as quickly as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean in any specific point in time that the logistics will all match up. But over time, if those logistical changes hadn't been made, then you're right. He would have been sitting there for a whole lot longer. And so, an investment will keep reaching out to make the thing more and more efficient.
I think, just building on that, particularly on an export movement, whether it's in Canada or the U.S., a lot of times people look at the supply chain and think it ends at that grain terminal on the West Coast or where, and an issue, as Kevin